All right. And a very warm welcome. Lovely to have you here, Jim Saliba. We want to introduce you first before we jump in. I know we were just in the green room, Jim, and are anxious to talk about our topic today. But for everyone, our listenership out there, I'd love to introduce you to Jim. He's a certified coach, trainer, author, and public speaker with a BA, MBA, and over 30 years of experience in the leadership world. His career really began in the software engineering background before being promoted to management in the IT industry or sector, where he eventually became the VP of a $4 billion tech company. He worked tirelessly to gain the knowledge and experience to become a leader employees want to follow. He has been in the trenches and has conquered most challenges leaders face throughout their careers. So I'm so excited to have Jim here with us today so that we could talk about adaptability in leadership as well as development as a leader. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you for having me here today, Angie. I'm thrilled to be here.
Wonderful. So, Jim, super excited to unpack based on your leadership background and extensive experiences, what have been some of the core learnings that you've stumbled upon when it comes to adaptability?
When it comes to adaptability, the big thing to adapt means change, right? And people are often just resistant to change.
Mm-hmm.
I really invested a lot of time trying to figure out what that resistance is. And
Mm-hmm.
I brought it down to what I call the four fears of leadership.
Okay.
Fear is what holds us from moving forward and going and doing that change.
Mm-hmm. And so when you say the four fears of leadership, what does that look like? Can you tell us more?
Sure. The four fears. The first one is the fear of incompetence, or we often call the imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Holds us back. It really erodes confidence, and that's what stops us from changing. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing is, it's not just us we're affecting. You affect a whole team and organization that's below you. So when you're in this imposter syndrome, decisions slow down because you want to get it right. You don't want to be called out as doing something wrong. You're
Mm-hmm.
creating a culture of uncertainty below you. And
Mm-hmm.
then the second fear is fear of appearing foolish. I might be
Mm-hmm.
in a new position. I don't want to do something to look stupid, right? Quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote, right? But this also creates a culture below of uncertainty underneath you. The third fear is the fear of failure.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we've all felt this at one point or another. And that also creates a culture of blame, actually. And I've seen
Mm-hmm.
this so often because we don't want to fail, so we push off decision making to someplace else. We deflect it, maybe upward. So when something goes wrong, we have somebody to point to and blame.
Mm-hmm.
So I avoid accountability and I look for blame.
Mm-hmm.
The last one is the fear of being vulnerable or appearing vulnerable. And that also creates uncertainty and insecurity in the teams below you. So when I
Mm-hmm.
talk to clients, we try to pinpoint where they are in there, and it helps us move forward and then adapt.
Absolutely. And I'm enjoying it. And I can hear the coach approach and what you're saying and moving forward and adapt because oftentimes we know that in coaching, it's reflecting slightly to understand what that thing is or maybe what that roadblock is, but catapulting forward and not ignoring the journey or the path per se, but rather really looking to help stand beside that coaching client or that leader so that they can identify their own fears or one of the four F's to be able to acknowledge and move forwards.
Well, often in that coaching, yes, we want to understand what's going on so we can move forward, but it allows us to dig in deeper and
Mm-hmm.
understand triggers that are happening. So we can develop tools that are in your tool belt. So when you feel those triggers, you can be confident and shift and use some of those tools to move forward rather than to shrink and move back.
Exactly. And what stirred the passion in you, Jim, to really focus on leadership per se?
So I guess the idea of business has always been thrilling for me. I always tell people I divide the world of IT into two buckets.
Mm-hmm.
One is big IT shops that help run businesses. And in the East Coast, where I originally am from, that's mostly what you would call it, financial companies, advertising companies, and so on. The other side is about building product. And we see this all the time, our smartphones and all the software that comes up on it and all the apps.
Mm-hmm.
You have Google and Facebook and all that. I love the product side. It is amazing and how it has changed and how technology has changed. It went back from whatever large companies give us to
Mm-hmm.
consumers really controlling where we go. The problem
Mm-hmm.
is consumers are very fickle, and we can change on a dime. Just watch our social media.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so when you're thinking about the tech industry specifically, because we know that when it comes to leadership, a lot of the theories are the same, but in many instances, or I should say, and in many instances, there's an opportunity to really understand different demographics, like construction versus technology per se, because there's different nuances that take place within these demographics. What have you noticed, Jim, that's super important in the tech industry from a leadership perspective?
In the tech industry, oh, it's interesting. I'll give you an example. I've basically been in tech. It
Mm-hmm.
moves fast. It's not the big that eats the little. It is the fast that eats the slow.
Mm-hmm.
That's tech. You have to make decisions. And when I first kind of moved a bit out of tech and into a big consulting firm, and there were a lot of partners, it took forever to make decisions. And for me, it was like jumping off a speeding train. I, I just couldn't stand it because things took long to make decisions. And that's kind of getting back to some of the how it changes the culture underneath the organization. What
Absolutely.
I do in the meantime while decisions are being made, uh,
Mm-hmm.
things move very fast, even in the slow ones that I call slow. It's much faster than some of the other areas that I've been in. So each one has its own nuance. Tech
Mm-hmm.
is interesting, especially in product development. It moves very quickly.
Yeah, definitely. I've noticed in the industry that where there's the strengths, it's the strengths in the sense of being able to speak from a place of candor and have debates.
Mhm.
There's strengths in the sense of being able to pick out nuances, and be able to work towards problem solving, which I really appreciate. In the same breath, from a leadership perspective, what I've also noticed is that there's an opportunity for growth around communication, especially in this remote work environment nowadays, right? Like often there's be frank, there's a lot of tech companies that have been doing this remote work since before it was cool, right? But
Yes, yes.
in the same breath, communication, I feel, is one of the larger skills amongst emotional intelligence and other leadership core competencies, especially in tech, that's needed to understand their team members and how to continue to engage them versus focusing on being competitive from a compensation perspective. I'm not saying that there's no value in that. There definitely is.
Mhm.
But it's an added layer, I do believe.
There is a lot of pieces that makes a winning team or a winning organization. I had a webinar about a month or so ago, and I talked about what I think were the 10 attributes of a great team. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
communication was in it, but not just communication, being to openly communicate, which
Mm,
also means open conflict. We can have different ideas, but let's talk about them. Let's decide on what is best and move forward. And I actually used a bad word in that sentence. I used the word decide, and I actually tell people not to decide.
Mhm.
The word decide, the root word means to kill off. You have homicide, suicide, insecticide. So when
Interesting.
we have the process of deciding, we take the list of ideas that we have or the options and we kill them off one by one until
Yeah.
there's one left.
Hmm.
But when we do this, we don't necessarily know all the information.
Mm.
So we start moving forward and we get more information. We start learning, and it may not turn out to be going the direction we thought it was going into.
Hmm.
But I can't do anything else because I killed off all the other options. So this is how we get into sunk costs. And we don't adapt and we don't change because we only have this one route to move forward. So instead, it is experimenting and using the best option. And when we experiment, it has a hypothesis, what we're going to do, and what we should find at the end
Hmm.
to decide to go forward or not.
Hmm.
And if it doesn't work, we have the option now to go back to those other ideas, add more information because we know more now,
Hmm.
and now pick the newest option to move forward.
Hmm.
If it did work, which many times it does happen, it says, okay, we have proof that this is the right way to go. What's the next experiment to move us forward?
Yeah,
So learning and experiment.
connecting the dots, Jim, I think what I'm hearing is when it comes to adaptability, you're learning, being curious and experimenting. You're not looking in the face of fear around change, and having those homicidal decisions of taking
Yes,
apart
yes,
or taking away things, but rather discovering, testing, having open conversations from a place of candor, and then making the best decision based on the information that you have at hand.
that's right. And and it's learning through experimenting.
Mm.
How often do we do companies have these beginning of the year, the big strategic planning? But what happens is somewhere along the way, things change. We get more information.
Yes.
If COVID showed us anything, it's that life can change on a dime.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and if, unless we're willing to see that and adapt and try other things, it's not going to, we're not going to survive. And we have
Definitely.
too many examples out there of that.
So let's dial into some examples specifically around leadership, Jim. How have you helped your clients in past really adapt to those changing environments or the changing strategies, changing attitudes, or different types of behaviors in the workplace?
Well, you used a lot of key coaching words there, right? Behavior, right? We end up with processes in an organization or behaviors as an individual that may not be beneficial to us anymore. They may have
Mm-hmm.
been worked at one time,
Mm-hmm.
or even put it in for a specific reason,
Mm.
but the world changes. And unless we're willing to relook at them and be able to change them and adapt to them, we're going to get stuck in a world and the world in a world, and the rest of the world is going to move by us.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
Right?
And
You still have a Nokia phone, right?
no, I don't.
Right?
No. And what was coming up for me, I just had this epiphany because I mean, in a past life in HR, a lot of processes and systems would come into play, right? And oftentimes, we would actually write the policies that we wouldn't look at them for minimally a year, maximally it could be like 3 to 4 years or when applicable. And so you have all these systems, not just operational, but across organizations that are demanding of us to look at it in a different manner. I'm not saying throw systems out of the, out with the bathwater, but I'm saying, it gives us an opportunity to be a bit more innovative and adaptive with those types of systems as well.
Yes. I watch the word innovative because it tends to be overused. But whenever we
Correct.
use the word innovative, we think about product and
Mm-hmm.
services.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to think about innovation of processes, internal, our own behavior. We can
Yes.
be innovative yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I worked for a company many years ago, Computer Associates. They're no longer around. Um, but often you would have to go from one team to another, and it was commonly called reinventing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
really wanted you to be able to pick up almost anywhere in the company, have the attitude of learning,
Mm-hmm.
reinventing yourself, moving
Mm-hmm.
forward. And that's all change. It's not easy to do, and it didn't fit everyone.
Right.
But in today's world, and we're back to adaptability, you have to be able to adapt first within yourself before
Absolutely.
you can adapt outwardly.
Definitely. And for me, this comes up again and again in the sense that self-awareness really is that
Hmm.
key to unlocking so many different things when it comes to being, a best practice, quote unquote, leader, or someone that's consistently reinventing your journey around leadership.
You said the word self-awareness. I tell people about leadership, go and Google the top 10 skills needed for a good leader. And you'll find communication and delegation and a whole list of other things.
Mm-hmm.
There's two that top it all. One is self awareness, and the other one is self development.
Absolutely.
Without those two things, none of those other ones will ever matter because your
Absolutely.
blind spots won't go away. Your fear won't go away. You have to understand those two basic things first. They're not
And
easy. They're great
absolutely.
words, but they're not easy.
No, I honestly, I haven't done this, to be totally honest, but I would love to Google where the word soft skills came from. Like why is it called soft skills? Because there's nothing soft about learning these skills and habits that call us leaders as humans, right?
Right,
Um,
right.
at the end of the day, what's coming up for me, Jim, is that, you know, oftentimes what I hear is leaders will come into the coaching call or they'll come into the facilitation room and they'll say, yeah, it's great to develop self-awareness. And of course I can ask my employees, but they don't say anything. And for me, what the way that I look at it is that as the leader, we're fundamentally responsible for our actions and how we're learning, as well
Mhm.
as our team members. And I feel like that little snippet sometimes is missed. So, in that particular example, as a leader, it's fair to say, hey, I'm working on my communication skills, Jim, and specifically around
Mhm.
active listening. I want to check in with you. Do you feel that I've been doing a better job at listening? So, you're basically not you're creating a psychological safe space for your team members to give that candid feedback. I think that's really, really important. And in some circumstances, even with my team today, I've had to say to them, look, this is not this is not a this is not a muse to get information and then come back at you at all. Really wanting to get candid feedback, and here's where I'm at with this. And that speaks to what you had said earlier around exhibiting and not being fearful of being vulnerable, right?
Yes, I was going to circle back to that same topic. Being able to say to someone, hey, I'm working on this. I'm working on my presentation skills. When you listen to me, count the ums that I have, right? I
Mm,
want the ums out of my list, right? But I have to be vulnerable enough to be able to say that out loud to someone and trust someone to make it happen. And if I'm there with a virtual suit of armor everywhere I go into a meeting, that isn't going to happen. And
no.
I find this a lot when I coach women leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that they have to show that they are not vulnerable. but I
Mhm.
think vulnerability can be their superpower.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of unpacking that topic on itself, Jim, I do
Oh,
believe. But
yes.
but but that aside, you're absolutely correct in the sense of being able to utilize empathy, compassion, and vulnerability as a combination as a superpower, especially in women, because naturally and socially it's a bit more accepted at this point in time, unfortunately. I tend to agree 100%. And adding to the fact that not just women, but regardless of how you identify, normalizing vulnerability in the workplace. Like
Mhm.
understanding that there isn't such a thing of leaving your shit home. You just don't.
Right.
We are a whole person, regardless of if we're at work or at home. So it's, I think it's to your point, it's a whole host of things and skill sets and leadership that really allows us to adapt. So, for example, if someone loses their transmission in their car that day, are you really going to press them for a deadline that's not due for another 3 days? More than likely not. I would hope not, right? Or conversely, if someone's child's sick and it's the fifth time that week, as a leader, will you be annoyed? Slightly, yes. Will you question it? Depends on context and history with that person. But at the end of the day, believing that your team members are trying to do the best job that they can, I think is really important as well. And I think that partners nicely with vulnerability because that helps create that soft landing space for your team members to be able to show up as their whole intentional self in the workplace.
I agree. You're a whole person. I ask people, how are you at work? How do you show up? And how do you show up at home?
Mm,
If it's two completely different people, you have to think about what's going on here. Because
absolutely.
if I
Yeah.
am putting things around me as a leader, it's using 10 times as much energy than if I can be myself, right? So you're asking a lot of yourself. And, you know, learn by example. You do it, and people are very perceptive. You're building culture, either organically and letting it go on its own, or you're doing it strategically. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're not doing it strategically and you are in that space where you feel vulnerable and you're wearing that virtual suit of armor, and my soft skills are, or what I call core skills of
Yes.
leadership,
Yes.
right, aren't where they should be, what are you doing about it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Curious to understand, Jem, just checking in. Have you heard in past that not always, but frequently, leaders will say, I just don't have time for that. There's this going on, there's that going on, et cetera, et cetera. How do you show the value? And today we're specifically talking about adaptability in leadership. How do you show the value so that leaders take that pause that's ever so needed to be able to reflect on their self awareness and how they're learning and adapting?
That's a big question because I ask myself that very often
Mm-hmm.
because so many times I see the need of coaching within leaders, but they don't understand the value that they're going to get out of it.
Yeah, yeah.
But put it down to numbers from an HR side. How many people are coming and going in the company? Are they turning over quickly, right? Um, am I missing deadlines? Is it taking too long to get things done? These are all kind of outshoots of
Mm-hmm.
not doing your job as a leader and taking the time to have those things happen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're all busy. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to put that time in, but
Mm-hmm.
having a coach is a great tool to have. The further you move up the ladder, the harder it is to find a mentor to talk about. The
Mm-hmm.
harder it is to find somebody that you can open up and have a sounding board to. But it is just so important to be able to do that. And I think that's my biggest tool as a coach. Quite honestly, sometimes at the end of a coaching session, I'll ask my client, what did you get out of this? And they
Mhm.
go on a big list. And I'm like, okay, I'm not sure I did that. You're the one that figured it out, only because I held the space open
Right.
and time for them to think about things out loud. Otherwise, they're back to what you said. I just don't have time for that.
Mhm.
Right. As soon as they take time, they actually end up saving time.
I'll bite, Jim, because the coaching, I have a personal bias when it comes to coaching, but I want everyone to hear it from your desk or your perspective. What is it about coaching that has such a high success rate?
Okay. So simple. Go to training. Lots of statistics there.
Hmm.
Somebody can go to a training class unless they start using the things right away. Within a few days, 70% of what happened in that training class is forgotten.
Correct.
Right? I call it the 6 o'clock trap because you used to go out into a classroom. Now it's virtual. You get your book, you do your thing. By 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, it's done. You put the book on the shelf. We forget all about it.
Hmm.
When you add coaching to it, or even just coaching by itself,
Hmm.
you are experimenting. I'm back to that word. You are trying things out. You are learning. Adults are different than kids. When
Very
we were
much
young,
so.
in elementary school, we just soaked it in. We learned. As adults, we're experiential. We learn by doing, and we learn more by things that don't work than with things that do work.
Hmm.
When we try things out and we take the time to say, that worked, that didn't work, what do I do differently next time? How do I
Hmm.
persevere or pivot? Makes changes and that actually very quickly. And that's what coaching is all about. It's really
Hmm.
getting people to think about things, try things out, learn from it, do the next thing.
Absolutely. And chiming in there, Jem, from my desk as well, I strongly believe that when it comes to finding the right coach, that's what it comes down to.
Yep.
Sometimes you may need to work with a couple coaches for them to really see you and hear you. And it's not coming from a place of warm, fuzzy, rose-colored glasses, but rather someone that can call you out to a place of
Mhm.
elevation, right? There's nothing
Yes.
better than sitting in a coaching session. And I'll never forget when I went through my certification, just a sidebar conversation here. When I went through my certification, to your point, I thought that it was going to be online learning. I'd get my book, I'd do the quiz, I'd pass the course. I'm a coach. I can do this in a breeze, no worries. In actuality, what really happened was I had to do work on myself. Like that wasn't advertised in all of this. And as a coach, you really need to work on yourself to get to those higher echelons to be able to work with strong leaders or leaders that want
Yep.
to grow. The biggest piece that I can advocate for in the sense of coaching is that it really helps you understand yourself. And that's where that part of self awareness comes in because you
Mhm.
get almost immediate validation or devalidation based on how your coach is asking you questions and how they're um, getting you to look at your own blind spots, essentially, would be the correct way to put it. And then at the end of the day, it's not just like, okay, we learned this thing, to your point, Jim. Then it's like, okay, Ange, go back in the world and experiment about this belief. What is your new belief now? And did you find any other blind spots in that belief? And what does that look like for tomorrow?
I you're singing to the choir. Yeah. Um, it is really getting them to open up their mind, stop and think a little bit.
Right,
I say, I'm not doing anything really you can't do on your own.
right.
Working with a coach adds rocket fuel to it,
Mm,
right? We
mm,
get to hold up the mirror and ask those questions that they maybe know they need to ask themselves and avoiding asking because of some fear or they don't really want to know the answer. I
absolutely.
had someone that I was coaching, and he's new to his job. He's at a director level. He's doing new things. And I asked, well, what about the next level? What are you going to do? What are you thinking about? Well, if I do this and do that, I do a good job. I'll be considered for the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, what about your review? When's your next review?
Mm-hmm.
What's it going to say? And I said, well, why are you waiting for it to be in writing
Yeah,
before you have a conversation about it?
absolutely. Absolutely.
And it got quiet for a long time. And he was like, I know, you're right. I should be talking about it now. I shouldn't be waiting for it. I never thought of that. And
And this is
this,
another area I'm gonna get on a soapbox for a second here, Jim. This is another area that I'm passionate about, and that's performance, because I didn't personally realize that I was responsible for my success specifically until I started my own business. And then I had that epiphany. Maybe it was the maturity in my brain. I don't know. But then I had that epiphany in the sense that regardless of where you work, whether you work for yourself or someone else, you are just as responsible for your success in your career as your leader, right? And it's a
Mhm.
two-way street. And this is where I'm coming back to the point around adapting. So from a performance perspective, there's a lot of opportunities to adapt. Whereas adapting and having less judgment if your team members come to you and ask for a raise, start asking questions as to what's promoting that. Because 9 times out of 10, it's not really about the money. It's about perceived unfairness, or it's about not feeling validated or not heard.
Mhm.
There's adaptability around how we do our performance reviews. Some companies are moving towards the coach approach, others not so much, and keep it in writing and have those kind of back and forth calibrations. There's so much value in having two-way conversations with your team members to understand who they are. How are they motivated? What about their
Yep.
engagement? What do they want to do? Are they happy where they're at? What types of projects could you also utilize their strengths? Those
Yes.
types of things.
So what started me on that path, early in my career, our company had Dale Carnegie training
Mm,
on site. And I was learning, I was an early manager at the time. And that kind of started my whole coaching persona as a manager.
I love it.
I turned around and I said to my team, okay, I'm changing how we do our meetings. So we do our weekly status meeting, that's good. But our one-on-ones are no longer my meeting, they're your meeting. All
Mm-hmm.
but the first one, they're all yours after that. Please give me an agenda the day before so I can be prepared for you.
Mm-hmm.
And at
Absolutely.
least once a month, I want to see personal development somewhere in that agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And once I started doing that, a couple years later, I was moving within the company, or other people were moving out of my team to someplace else in the company. And they said, Jim, can I still have that monthly development meeting? You, right?
Yeah.
All it was is coaching,
Mm-hmm.
them telling me what it is they wanted out of life. Where do they want to
Yeah.
go?
Yeah.
Me as a boss trying to clear the runway for them. I used
Mm-hmm.
to go as far as lending people out a few hours a week to other departments. And other managers said, when their jaw picked up off the floor, they said, you're doing what? And why are you doing this? But I'd rather see people move out of my team somewhere else within the company than move out of the company.
Absolutely. Yes, I definitely can get behind and subscribe to that for sure. Because going back to an earlier point with regards to asking questions of lagging indicators is what you were pointing to in the sense of leveraging your leadership, or increasing your adaptability in leadership, is that no longer is it 2 times an employee's salary to replace them. Oftentimes it's 2.5 to 3 times. Like the
Yep.
stats are creeping up. And then on top of that, we have a workforce across North America anyways of baby boomers that are retiring. So there's
Yes.
multiple things going on top of pandemic type
Mhm.
things that leaders need to really consider in the sense of how they're adapting. And what's really interesting is when you think about change, there's definitely process and procedures that you can wrap around that. But if you don't have those human skills, like a growth mindset,
Mhm.
self-awareness, like you had said, lifelong learning, looking at diverse perspectives, flexibility in how you decide things. You pointed to that earlier in the podcast, using a great example, jumping back into kind of like the fifth grader scientist experiences. If you don't have all of those core human skills, then you're not going to be able to influence that change as a leader.
Yes. And honestly, from my perspective, leaders have a harder time now than maybe in previous generations,
Absolutely.
right? Things are moving a lot faster.
Mm-hmm.
Where you used to be able to be either really good, long-term, strategic, visionary,
Yes.
or really good at executing. You could, and you could be one of those, but now you kind of need both.
Not only that, I would actually debate you in the sense that when it comes to leadership styles, I look at them more as tools in your tool belt. Like the diversity of how you are being called upon to lead or called to a higher place to lead ranges from sometimes you're being that democratic leader, sometimes it's the visionary leader, sometimes it's the
Mhm.
coach approach. In emergencies, we might be a bit more autocratic, et cetera, et cetera. So, I don't feel like we're adopting any one leadership style anymore, but the necessity to understand what type of leadership styles are out there and how you can adapt in each environment, situation, sometimes by team member.
Yes. So I spend a lot of time talking to clients about this and helping them understand what their natural or their go-to leadership
Mm-hmm.
style is. And
Mm-hmm.
that's great.
Mm-hmm.
They, just as you said, they have to be able to learn and adapt and use some of those other leadership styles when the situation calls for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we need to figure out and soft skills and all that to understand when we need to be able to change, adapt, and use those different leadership
Yes,
styles,
absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Otherwise, we overuse the one,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that could be just as harmful than not having a good leadership style at all.
Yes. Yes, I tend to agree. I like that add on. Jim, I know that I could talk to you for hours on end. This has been absolutely amazing. Before you go, tell us more about your book. I'd like to give you the opportunity to express a little bit more about that and where we can find you.
Okay, so my book released just about a year ago,
Mm-hmm.
September of last year. It's called the Six-Step Leadership Challenge. It's more of a how-to than many of the theoretical leadership books that are out there. And it talks about a lot of things that we said today. And part of the steps are, how do I look at myself? How do I engage the environment and the workplace around me, right? Retrospective. Then it's looking forward. What do I want to do in life? I
Mm-hmm.
have this thing called my four quadrants of leadership: vision and strategy, learning through execution, being able to have culture, people, processes. And the last one is about executive presence. And
Mm-hmm.
what pieces of those do you need to grow to be able to get you from where you are now to where that vision is? And we
Mm-hmm.
start building a plan to make that happen. So I use that a lot when I'm coaching people, as you can imagine. But I put it on paper and I put a bunch of ideas in there. I have a couple other books that I'm working on: how to use the six-step leadership challenge to build a better team or an
Mm-hmm.
unstoppable team, how to use the six-step leadership challenge for your next promotion, and things like that, right? It's getting a little targeted.
Yeah,
Um,
amazing.
the book is on Amazon, but if you go to my website, jamessaliba.com, it'll pop up, and it's a little cheaper on my website than if you get it on Amazon because, I want people to visit my website.
We can understand that
Yeah.
for
You'll
sure.
also find me on LinkedIn at
Mhm.
James Saliba. You'll find me there. I'm on Twitter. And please, on my LinkedIn profile is a link for a virtual coffee if you want to chat. It's open for people. Feel free if you want to reach out and extend our discussions.
That's great, Jim. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.